Hello, good morning, good afternoon. Anybody here?
Hi,
Okay.
yes,
Oh,
Oh,
okay.
but I haven't seen the host yet.
yeah, this looks like a CSI implementation meeting. With the usual suspects.
Okay, let's go ahead and get started. We got a small group here, but I think we can get going. Can everyone hear me okay?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. So first up on the agenda is to discuss volume expand and resize issues. Second on the agenda is when we're going to cut the 1.3 release. And then finally discuss if we can have a mailing list dedicated to CSI driver developers. So maybe let's go backwards because the last couple items are going to take less time potentially than the resize one because that's a large open-ended discussion. Does that sound okay?
Yeah, sounds fine to me.
Okay. A new mailing list to communicate with CSI developers. This idea came out of a discussion we were having in the Kubernetes community of, hey, if there are changes that are ever made that require CSI driver vendors to update their driver for any reason, we don't have a good way to be able to communicate out to them. So it would be nice to have a mailing list that all the CSI driver vendors are on that we can use to communicate with them. I guess there was general consensus about that, but there is kind of debate about what the name of that list should be. And so I wanted to open up that discussion and see what folks think.
So the purpose of this mailing list is to have a discussion. Like it's not just announcing changes, but it's also a place for CSI people who write drivers to ask questions, get answers.
Yeah, we could either have two different mailing lists, one discuss and one announce, or we could just have a single one.
Maybe two different ones would be better, as you might have a lot of traffic of the asking questions one, and the announcements one is really important that probably everybody see and pay attention to. Just guessing.
It's reasonable.
At the same time, people who don't care about other discussions and then just care about announcements could use string-based filter to just filter announcements. I mean, I don't know what the traffic will look like. So if
So we already have a CSI community mailing list. We could use that as discussion rather than create another one.
we should sorry.
Can you I'm forgetting right now, but could do we have an example of something that we want to announce
A breaking change, for example, let's say
in CSI or in Kubernetes?
either, potentially. Ideally, we have one forum to be able to communicate with all CSI driver authors.
So we have container storage interface working group. Is that the only mailing list we have, right?
Correct. And we've got SIG storage, but that's Kubernetes specific, very storage specific there.
But I guess like if say, I guess the example I'm thinking of is we in Kubernetes in 118, we deprecated the behavior of creating Kubernetes creating the mount target path. Like, would that be more
Yes.
fitting for a Kubernetes mailing list rather than a CSI mailing list?
I think the problem with the Kubernetes mailing list is it's too broad, too wide, and CSI driver authors are not necessarily going to be on it. But are you
Would we
suggesting?
expect all CSI driver authors to be on the Kubernetes 6 storage mailing list?
I don't think so, because Kubernetes SIG storage is more oriented at folks who are interested in developing the Kubernetes storage subsystem and working on that, not necessarily just using it.
Well, we can never be sure that like if all driver authors will be there on one list or not. And the looking at traffic at the community mailing list is pretty low. So not
Now,
having.
I can buy the argument if you want to split out a CSI driver announce versus a Kubernetes CSI driver announce, but I don't think that's necessary. I could buy the argument though. Okay, if there are no objections, I propose going with CSI driver announce. And instead of having a CSI driver discuss, just use the existing CSI community one.
Perfect.
Any objections, any suggestions, any concerns?
No, sounds great.
All right.
The
Cool.
only thing is like it's the only place where spec the community mailing list is recorded is the spec.md file, and that's probably fine, but we probably should advertise it in other places too.
Yeah, I think we should update the CSI somewhere in the CSI repo to point to this, as well as the Kubernetes CSI documentation.
Yeah.
Try to get as many driver vendors on here as possible.
Yeah.
Okay, I'll take an action item to set these up.
Would it be fair to assume that anybody in the community list is going to want to get the announce messages?
That's a good question. What do folks on the call think?
I think that seems reasonable.
So you
Yes.
add the community list to the announce list as a member.
Yeah.
Okay, that seems reasonable. So when I create this, I'll just auto add the existing community list there. All right, moving right along. Next item is the CSI. Is it 1.3 or 1.4? I'm losing track here. The next CSI release. The big changes in this release are the volume health alpha. And then there are potentially, it's 1.3. So there's potentially resizing changes that may or may not come. So when do we want to cut it is the question. What do y'all think? So based on my kind of discussions with Hemant in the last Kubernetes resize meetings, I think the potential changes that we're going to want for resize are going to be significant, and potentially they're going to require changes to the CSI drivers or like a action required. And given that for the 119 Kubernetes release, we're trying to minimize any action required changes, I would lean towards cutting a 1.3 with just CSI volume health alpha, getting the resize changes after, and then cutting a 1.4 at some time in the future.
Should we like maybe talk through the resizing changes before maybe taking that call?
Okay, yeah, that seems reasonable. So let's switch to volume resizing, and Hemant, I'll hand it over to you. I'll stop sharing.
Okay, so I need to find the share button, right? So where is it? I want to share the screen maybe. Okay, so hopefully you can see my screen.
Yep.
Okay, just minimize it. So this is a work in progress PR, but basically there are two issues that this tries to fix. One is, the first one is that the offline capability uses the word offline indicates that the volume currently published and available on a node shall not be expanded via offline expansion if it is not offline. Let me just go to this. So the problem is, sorry. Yeah, so the current wording says that offline indicates that the volume currently published and available on a node should not, I change it. So it says shall not be expanded via controller expand volume when, yeah, publication should not be expanded, shall not be expanded, and shall is same as must. And there's another occurrence of must word explicitly in where the offline capability is talked about. And this presents a problem in at least in Kubernetes, where like we cannot reliably with 100% certainty determine if the volume is in use or not, or volume is published to a node or not. And it's detecting that or trying to decide that is kind of racy. It has race conditions that are kind of hard to fix. And as a result, it's enforcing that like is very hard. And I just want to bring another thing, which is, sorry, let me find it. Okay, the another thing is that actually the controller expand volume request error code has explicit return for if the volume is in use. I'm just trying to find it. Go. It would be probably not in proto file. It will be probably in spec.md file. Sorry. Okay, so there's another occurrence of the word must that has been, I have changed. I'm proposing to change in to should in the PR. We can talk about the, yeah, okay. So if you see the errors returned, there's a failed precondition error that says volume in use, indicates that the volume corresponding to the specified volume ID could not be expanded because it is currently published on a node, but the plugin does not support online expansion capability. So we like, the problem is that we do have a special error code when this happens, but because the wording here uses shall and must, if the CO does call controller expand volume, and if volume is published to a node, it's a violation of spec, and that's problematic. So that's why this PR relaxes this requirement from shall to should, so that a plugin, a driver author can expect that even if it only supports offline expansion, it could still receive controller expand volume calls if volume is already published to a node. So that's the first issue that.
Sorry to interrupt, but the whole point of saying shall not or must in that case is because that is a bug. If a CO sends that, the plugin should consider it as a bug and return that error. That's fine. The wording, I think it's fine in that case.
Yeah, I'm inclined to agree. I kind of feel like the spec can't make guarantees about the behavior of the CO.
Well,
So I would read that shall not as like, if you do it, it's an error. So.
but there's an error that would be expected in the course of actual running deployments, and then there's an error that would imply a failure to conform to the spec. Right? I mean, if we had a conformance test for COs, which we don't, we should, then it would make a difference there. So you could say this CO is not conformant.
Sure.
Yeah, but in any case, the
So
spec.
you hope and try, right? But that doesn't. I guess I'm kind of not like. There's going to be all kinds of plugins that are also not conformant that somehow manage to work together. The fact that this is difficult to conform to, and sometimes an error occurs, doesn't seem like a compelling argument to me.
Well, it should be possible. It should be possible to conform to the spec and work properly. I think that's otherwise, what's the value of having a spec?
Well, what does should mean? Like maybe, and then if we're making the statement that this is always an error.
No, the RFC says that should.
Sorry, and that's an error, and that's why the plugin must respond that failed precondition. That's the whole point of saying that it must be done. And if it's not done, that's why you have the error code listed explicitly.
Right. So the expectation is the one problem is that having the wording as clear as possible, like, gives plugin authors like somebody's writing doing this like in a testing environment. While testing it, they write plugin and they read the spec. It says shall and must, like it says here must, like that I'm deleting and replacing with should. So the plugin author thinks, oh, I'm fine, I only implement offline, and they test it and it works, but in production they start getting controller expand volume call.
But the whole point of having a whole spec is that they must read it whole. So if they read 2 paragraphs later and they see that, ooh, these are the errors that I must watch out for, and there is an explicit one saying, you must return this if you get it, regardless of whether the CO must do it, you must watch out for it, right?
Yeah, I mean, that seems reasonable, but at the same time, like what Ben was saying, that spec, the wording of the spec should be implementable. If the spec is hard to implement, then there's.
Yeah, I mean, if the spec says the CO must do something, then SP should be able to rely on it doing that. And if there are COs that, if we don't want to hold them to that, then we should change it to should. That's the distinction between should and must.
Okay.
So let's take a step back.
Sounds good.
What's happening here is this functionality for volume resize was introduced in, I believe, Kubernetes CSI 1.1. It was after the 1.0 release. And with the functionality that came before 1.0, what we did was we got it into the spec. Then the different COs went back and tried to implement it, and we tried to get a driver to implement that functionality. And in doing that, we discovered issues. We revised the spec, made breaking changes between 0.1, 0.2, 0.3, and 0.4. And so by the time we had 1.0, we had a good understanding that the functionality worked. Now, the problem with volume resize was it got introduced in CSI 1.1, and we did not have any concept of alpha, beta, or GA. What that meant was this resize functionality was immediately GA'd, but there was no concrete implementation on the CO side or on the driver side. And so when folks went to go and implement this functionality on the Kubernetes side and implement drivers, what Hemant discovered was the offline capability, even though we allow it to be advertised, is very difficult to actually implement on the Kubernetes side. And so what happened is the current implementation on Kubernetes of volume resize completely ignores the offline capability. So the spec says this thing exists. If you are a naive author, you go and read the spec, you say, oh yeah, I want this offline behavior. I'm going to advertise this capability. Kubernetes completely ignores it. And so initial kind of reaction to that is, oh, that's, this is a Kubernetes bug. Kubernetes should be doing the right thing. And so we've spent, I think, the last 3 weeks talking through what we could do on the Kubernetes side to fix this. And we haven't been able to come up with a good answer. Now, what's being proposed here is not great, in my opinion. What we're asking to do is make changes to the spec. I think the first question is always, are these changes backwards compatible? So that's the first thing we should consider. And then the second thing is along the lines of what's being asked, which is, should we, if it is okay to make these changes, should we make the changes, or should we try to force the CO to do the expected behavior here? And basically, is it okay to make the change? So maybe let's start with the first part, which is, are changes like this okay to make, or is it backwards compatibility breaking?
So yeah, so the reason we could not do this in Kubernetes, we have known about this problem that we are not checking the capability. I think Zinga opened this bug around a couple of months back. So we didn't want to put a fix in the Kubernetes that was not 100% foolproof, and we could not do it because of the race conditions and whatnot. So first thing, so let's talk about if it is a breaking change or not. This one is kind of sits in the middle because there's already an error code that you are the plugin or plugin is expected to receive. So it's not like you were not supposed to call and there was not. So sorry, yeah. So this change in particular fits somewhere in the middle because there's there was an explicit error condition that says, okay, it cannot be. If it does get called, then return this error code.
And actually, let's take a step back to make sure everybody's on the same page. Does everyone understand what the change is that's being proposed and why it's going to help?
Yep.
I guess I wonder is, with that additional context, is this a valuable capability in general? So, I mean, certainly in Cloud Foundry, we only support shared volumes, so we don't have resize, so that doesn't, but if Kubernetes is ignoring this, is Mesosphere doing anything with it, or is Mesos doing anything with it rather? And if not, maybe just tearing it out would be a better thing to do. I mean, that's a theoretically breaking change that in principle is wrong. But if
I thought there were some SPs which believed that that was the only way they could do things.
Well, so that becomes a problem, right? But tree falls in the woods and no one hears it. What difference does it make, right? So if the SP is advertising this thing that Kubernetes is going to turn around and ignore, then what difference does it make if it's in the spec or not?
Well, I think if we never fix it, then those SPs will never implement resize. But the hope is that if we fix this, then those SPs could implement resize in a way that would actually work.
Mm.
Yeah, so we actually have already implemented resize, but we run into this issue because we only support offline resize. And then, we got calls if it is online, then that's a problem. But we did add the check. I think, Haman, you have another concern, which is driver wouldn't know that they actually need to make this check themselves. And then if Kubernetes could not guarantee this check 100%, then it could fail at the runtime, right?
Yeah, I would think that all of that being the case, like if there's an SP that's implemented this and it doesn't work in Kubernetes, the right thing to do would be for Kubernetes to just reject the plugin or turn off resize or disable it or something like that. Because
not appropriate.
you're not actually solving anything if you change that.
No, but it does. But offline. But if you detach it and resize, that does work. That's still a helpful feature. So
yeah, there is a path to getting this to work.
Yeah.
You could just tear down the workload and then expand. So it does work. It's just the thing is, if it is, we want to prevent controller expand volume from being called if the volume is published to a node. And yeah, so.
Yeah, I'm still not following the thread of why changing shall to should.
The idea behind, I don't know if I made it clear, that the idea behind changing from shall to should is anybody who reads the spec gets a clear idea that, okay, controller, if the plugin, it may be called. Maybe like from shall to should, I would also probably have to add additional verbiage that says, okay, that the plugin may still expect the call. So that could be another update to this PR that I opened morning. So it's a little bit work in progress PR, but it could be made more obvious that the offline capability, like the driver, there are other parts of CSI spec also where they talk about the best case or the CO may still call something, which is which could result in an error code. So we can clarify it a little bit more rather than just one word change from shall to should. Or yeah.
And so I'd like to ask a question, or maybe just kind of explore Julian's suggestion a bit more. So the suggestion that was kind of interesting is, ripping out support for offline, and I understand that might seem kind of extreme, but I'd like to just think about that for a minute, because part of the context that Saad gave was that we did not have a concept of alpha. We only had, stable as a concept as far as the spec went back when we introduced this. And so I'm wondering if there's a path forward that consists of multiple steps. Step one is, if we're going to break the API anyway, or we're going to kind of break the API anyway, right? Like maybe we do that.
Breaking the API, we're not breaking it.
May I finish talking, please?
Yeah, sorry.
Thank you. So depending on your perspective, maybe it's a breaking change, maybe it's not, okay? Ripping out offline support certainly would be breaking, but hear me out. So step one would be ripping out offline. Step two would be reconsidering that portion of the API. Step three would be introducing it later in alpha form, or tagged as an alpha, which would give us flexibility, a little more flexibility to iterate. And And I think this is only viable right now because, additionally, of the context that that Saad gave, which is that Kubernetes ignores this now anyway. So even if drivers have implemented it, Kubernetes isn't using it. It doesn't sound like Cloud Foundry is using it. I haven't looked at the Mesos implementation in a while,
that's
but
not
it's
really right. No, it's not
Can I
like
please
Kubernetes
finish?
ignore
Can I
it.
please finish talking? Can I please finish talking? Thank you. I don't think Mesosphere is using it, or Mesos is using it. I know that Nomad recently enabled CSI support, but I don't know if they have resize for offline implemented. And so the thinking is that I guess my proposal is that if no one has successfully implemented support for this to begin with, is there a path forward that lets us rip it out and kind of rebuild offline support from an API perspective in a way that that lets us iterate more freely in the future until we're sure that we get it right? Because, and I suggest this, or I'm posing this because I'm not convinced, even if we move forward with the changes in this PR, I'm still not convinced that we've got it right. The resize API is extremely complex. In my mind, it's the most complex part of the spec, to be honest. we spent a lot of time talking about it, and there was a lot of back and forth. There's these different modes of operation, potentially conflicting modes of operation, right? Depending on which flags are set, it's really complicated. So, like, sure, maybe we could go forward with this PR as it is, and maybe that would solve this particular problem set. I'm kind of wondering if there's other things lurking under the covers that we haven't run into yet, and that maybe a safer bet would be to kind of gut it and reintroduce it later in kind of a more flexible alpha tagged form. So now you can all disagree with me. Thank you.
Yeah,
so
I disagree.
when we are ripping out offline, we have to probably rip out the whole capability thing, like the volume expansion capability, and as a top level plugin level capability altogether. I want to.
Please don't do that. We're in the middle of implementing it across about 4 drivers,
So,
but online.
yeah, sorry, sorry, I kind of interrupted you there. Can you, like, so earlier we heard Saad say that Kubernetes is ignoring this flag. And it sounds like, and I heard other people say that that's not fully true.
It's not, well, so it's not currently
Clarify.
checking this, but it actually has documented procedures on how to do this. How does offline resize work? There's a detailed document on how that works. It's just like we're right now not checking the capability.
So
it does not mean this does not work completely. Because online resize also has bugs, right? So it's not that you have bugs, then you just rip up the whole thing and start from scratch. I think that's the wrong way.
So, but
hold on, let's be clear about this.
Yeah.
On the offline side on Kubernetes, the check today has not been implemented. Is that right or wrong?
Correct. It's also not checking online. It's not checking anything.
But,
right.
but I think
does that
what
mean
I'm
the
hearing
online
is,
needs to be ripped off?
No. The online behavior is the default behavior, right? It doesn't require any special behavior whether workload is running or not.
But if a plugin does not even support resize at all, it's also not checking that part.
Oh,
Right?
that part is checking.
That part is in the controller side you check, but I mean, this is at the plugin side capability. We're not checking plugin side capability at all.
No, we are checking offline.
No?
We are checking whether it has expansion capabilities or not in the.
I think there was no check for either online or offline plugin capability last time I looked. That's why some driver they implemented this, but they didn't even know this is needed.
We can talk offline, but
the
offline capability is explicitly checked because.
I'm just saying that both online offline plugin capability is not checked right now.
But the point is that it doesn't really matter whether online capability is checked or not, right? It's kind of the default behavior. Offline is the special case where we're saying, hey, change the default behavior. Instead of always calling it, don't call it in this subset of cases. And that's the problematic one, because any volume plugin that depends on online, like for all intents and purposes, things normally work just fine. For a volume plugin that today expects offline, like your plugin does, then Kubernetes is just, it's not even trying, right? In the default case, it is just going to be.
It is going to try. It will. What do you mean it's not trying?
I mean, it's not trying to do the correct behavior. It's calling controller expand volume when it should not be.
Right, but then in the online, right? But in the online case, if you're not checking, you call it when it is offline. That is also wrong, right? It's the same.
What do you mean? I thought
but
online was.
If it's not attached, but you still call, then it's not going to work either.
Is that what online means?
No, the controller.
No, I verified that with the host pass plugin. It's only support online. I called it when it's not attached, and then that fails. Right?
So I think there might be some misunderstanding about what online offline means from my end. So
online.
Yeah, go ahead.
I was about to say that online doesn't, I think if you read this wording, online doesn't say that the plugin has to be online. It just says that it could be called both online and offline as well. Okay.
That was my understanding.
Well, but well, then maybe that's the implementation of the host plugin that is wrong then. That clearly failed for me. That's why I opened another bug for that one.
I think it's the implementation of host path.
Yeah, there's no requirement that says that the volume must be online for the online expansion to happen.
So yeah, that's why I'm more concerned about the offline case, because in that case we are just blatantly disregarding what that offline capability means.
Just to answer James, one thing, my vote is to not report actually, because plugin authors implement it, and there are like Azure, there are a bunch of plugin authors that implement it, and there was, maybe we should consider what could happen if, like, what other things that could happen, like the James alluded to, that is kind of broken. Like one user who showed up in implementation meeting was talking about they can only support expansion if volume is mounted, that is controller published, node published, but it's not in use by a workload. So their use case was like, they want the volume to be, so the volume is, so the kind of node expand volume is kind of online, it's always online, but they can only call it if the volume is, the pod has not started or workload has not started running it. So in that case, they rolled the change. They did not implement node expand volume because it only supports online for that reason, and they rolled whatever the housekeeping that needs to happen at the expansion time on the node into node stage or node publish. I forgot which, but that's the gist of it. And actually, just to address this case, this is the case we did talk about during the implementation thing with Julian and a bunch of other folks, where if this does happen, if we do, like if I have to roll back the history, then we talked about this case and we said, yeah, in that case, the plugin can roll like the housekeeping into node stage, node publish. And that's exactly what the plugin author did. So what other things that we got, or maybe it's like predicting the future is hard, but is it like, what other corner cases that we could think of, maybe, or we can talk about this in another.
You know, I'm leaning towards what James suggested, and the argument that I buy is that we are unlikely to just make one set of changes and get this perfectly correct again. And what I would like to do is have an API that we can call alpha, iterate and kind of implement it, figure out what the issues are, make breaking changes, and move forward from there. The counter argument that I'm hearing is plugins are expecting this offline behavior. So if you pull it out, you know, that'll be bad. So two things there. One is, if we go forward with ripping it out, we're talking about a CSI 2.0. So if you implement 1.0, you can continue to expect the existing behavior and know that there is a big fat bug in Kubernetes. Or you can implement 2.0 and hopefully Kubernetes will implement it correctly. And second is that we don't necessarily have to abandon offline altogether. What as I understand James is suggesting is it's like starting from scratch and saying, okay, let's figure out what we can do to make COs like Kubernetes able to implement offline properly, because clearly there are plugins that want this behavior.
Yeah, I guess the other question I have about this is, I think I heard that there's some kind of instructions to the end user about offline flows. And I guess I'm wondering, is it the case that with the correct instructions, a user of Kubernetes could get offline working if they follow the right set of steps?
Yeah. So in Kubernetes, offline used to be default behavior actually for a while, for like the initially, and online was implemented later on, and that's why like there are still the instructions exist, like what to do if you really want offline expansion. So that's why this documentation exists.
So I guess I would take that to mean like, maybe we need to broaden our thinking about the behavior of the CO a little bit, right? Like Kubernetes in the hands of a responsible user might be doing the right thing for offline. Kubernetes by itself won't, but
I am not sure if that's the case. So
okay.
if I am a user who knows about all of this, is there anything I can do to, is the documentation saying, oh, go and manually shut down your workload first, then do a resize? Is that what
Yeah.
That's what it is?
Mm-hmm. I think so. We can check it.
Would that still do the right thing?
Yeah, you bring it offline, then that will work.
Okay. Okay, all right. Then Julian's argument is sound. I guess he's saying Kubernetes in the hands of a responsible user reading all the documentation could do the right thing. Okay.
So, which I guess what I'm trying to get at here is like, if we were to just tear this offline feature flag out of the spec and say, yeah, this is what it would we actually be disabling valuable capabilities? It sounds like the answer is yes, because it could be made to work by a user following documentation and using plugins that have already gone and implemented this. So, yeah, that starts to feel like real actual pain for people.
And driver side also will have documentation. It's not just Kubernetes side, but each driver should have their own documentation about how to do this.
But I think one of the things that we've been kind of pitching for Kubernetes and for CSI is that the underlying storage implementation ideally is abstracted away from you. Mm-hmm. And to then say, oh yeah, except if you do resize with this particular volume plugin, please follow these manual steps where you have to go and manually figure out how to shut down your workloads, seems pretty bad. And I know within the Kubernetes side, when we were having this call, there were at least 2, possibly 3 volume plugin vendors on the call who said they were depending on this offline behavior. I think one was Shing, one was Chris, and then possibly Ben. I don't remember.
Azure and OpenStack is also, OpenStack Center is also offline. Some
OpenStack as well? I thought OpenStack was online.
No, some OpenStack is online.
Depends on the driver underneath.
No, depends on OpenStack version underneath. Like, yeah, which version of OpenStack you're running. Like, it's a recent thing, like online, but most OpenStack deployments are offline. They support offline expansion center volumes, and yeah, it could depend on underlying implementation as well. So, So Kubernetes cannot implement offline. It could do best case check and it could still leak through. That's the problem. I don't know, like that's the problem, right? Like it could implement like offline check the volume is, but it can it may not be like, yeah, it's racy basically. And that's why this PR proposes relaxing the wording from shall to should. And in my opinion, I know Southern James said that like there are other plugin authors like where they have implemented expansion capabilities and on node side and on control side. The only other issue that I have seen or heard about is what Chris was talking about, where like he didn't want that expansion to happen if the workload is running on node. But I'm not aware of any other issues with offline capability, to be honest.
Yeah, so
And
that one is worth kind of clarifying as well. So in our capability here, we have a single plugin capability for online versus offline. But the reality is that online and offline are implemented in two different places. One is the controller side and one is the node side. And it's possible that a given volume plugin may support online on one side, but offline on the other. And with the current implementation, you don't get that fine granularity. In fact, the current implementation, offline, online, appear to only reflect the controller side and say nothing about the node side, which implies that
it actually makes it clear that like the online offline capability only applies to controller expand volume, and I
right.
think there is wording that says that node expand volume is always online.
Exactly, and that's I think also a problem because we are aware of volume plugins that want to be able to control online versus offline on the node side.
We discussed that, Saad, like for this feature was introduced 2 years back, or at least 1.5 years back. So we discussed that plugins that want to implement offline on the node, and we discarded it. My concern, here's my concern. My concern is it took really long time to get where we are, even in like we have problems, yes, but it took really long time to get the consensus that we have. And for node side, that the issue that Chris brought up, where a user wants to implement node expansion, we explicitly, like at length, we talked about that issue, and we said, okay, if really a user wants to implement offline on the node, they could just roll it in this thing, and it's possible. It's possible to do it because volume expansion involves mutation. It's hard. The changes are hard, in my opinion. But the assumption that if we rip it out and like introduce as alpha feature, and there will be a solution presenting itself that will make everyone happy, I think it's not gonna happen because it's a difficult. There are different concerns. And it is things happening at the node, things happening at controller, and how plugins implement this behavior. It's a hard problem to solve.
Yeah, no, I buy the argument that this is a very complicated piece of CSI, and if possible, let's be pragmatic, right? Being idealistic is nice, but it means that our users are not going to be able to benefit from this functionality for a very long time, which sucks. I think somebody on this call, Tomas, said they're already implementing resize for 4 volume plugins. And so just to completely rip it all out and say, sorry, this isn't going to work is not really a starter either. So we need to find some sort of middle ground. But I disagree that we can't come up with a solution that works. I think the approach that I've seen work is put something out there, go and implement it, and then you'll find the issues with it, revise and implement again. And that worked really, really well with the initial CSI 1.0 because there were tons of issues that we found.
But is there a path forward that gets us to Nirvana without any backwards compatibility breaking changes?
That's the key.
Because if not, then we should say, okay, there will be a backwards compatibility breaking change somewhere along the way, and maybe the earlier the better. And maybe it takes the flavor of, you know, take it out and then put it back in as alpha. And so we just get that done as early as possible and then push through the rest of the ugly process.
Yeah, I agree with that as well. Like, if we're going to do that, do it as soon as possible rather than drag it out and have more vendors potentially impacted by this.
Okay, so it sounds like we're at the point of trying, so is the next step then to evaluate this PR in terms of API breakage and say, well, is it breaking or is it not? And then that drives our decision?
I think even if we did that, I share the same concern that you raised before, which is, does this address all the issues, or are we kind of playing whack-a-mole with, like, we think this addressed the issue that we are aware of, but then we're going to find something else that's going to put us in another weird corner. So ideally what I want is to have a holistic answer for all 4 of the big issues that are currently in discussion. And if we have an answer for all 4 of those and we believe those changes required for the CSI spec are not breaking, then it's, I think, fine. We should go forward with it.
I think sorry.
Yeah, go ahead.
Of the 4 issues, I think some were like more like Kubernetes side, or some like one was the deletion, the deletion blocking, like sorry, the PVC could be deleted while expansion is pending on the node. That's kind of not really a CSI problem. And we didn't have a chance to talk about where, like, maybe we could talk about the second issue, that's the read-only expansion on the node, and if we can
I have a hard stop at 1 o'clock.
Okay, so we've got 5 minutes left. Let's do this. Instead of kind of leaving this hanging, I'll schedule another CSI community call for next week, because otherwise this call is going to be in a month, and we can continue this discussion. I also want to close on, if we can, in the last 4 minutes, the CSI 1.3 release. Do we want to block on getting these volume resize changes in, or should we move forward with a cut with just the volume health stuff? I can kind of see both ways. On the one hand, I don't want to block volume health because resize could potentially take a long time. And on the other hand, the argument that if we're going to make any big breaking changes, we should do that as early as possible. So getting it into a 1.3 release would be ideal.
If it's a breaking change, isn't that us making it 2.0 anyway? Right? Like,
yes.
either it's breaking or it's not, right?
So I think, can we defer the vote until the next meeting? Because it sounds like we're still trying to get a handle on what it means to change CSI to kind of accommodate these resize scenarios. So if we can, if a solution or that problem space can be presented holistically next meeting, then maybe we'll be in a better position to make that decision about 1.3.
Okay, that seems reasonable. Also, Hamad's been holding regular meetings on the Kubernetes side to discuss the resize issues. If anyone on this call is interested, please let him know. He's sending out the invite, I believe, to SIG Storage. So feel free to attend those. I think a lot of you have very interesting insights on the CSI side, so it would be good to get your insight on the Kubernetes side as well.
Yeah, I think this week I'll have a meeting. We'll have a meeting on Friday. Tomorrow, most of Europe is closed. Not tomorrow, on Friday, I think. But yeah, tomorrow I'm on PTO. Sorry.
Saad, for the next meeting, are you going to schedule this at the same time? Because we have the
that's a good question.
We have a data protection working group meeting at this time slot next week. So
okay, we could do an hour earlier.
Okay.
8 a.m. Pacific time, which is 11 Eastern. Wednesday, May 6th. Does that work for everyone?
I can squeeze that in.
That works for me.
The other option would be after the Kubernetes SIG storage meeting on Thursday next week, which is 10 a.m. Pacific, 1 p.m. Eastern, the 7th of May.
I prefer that.
Okay. Any objections to that time?
Hold on. What time is that? 7? Is that 7th?
It's the 7th, and
p.m.
it's 1 p.m. Eastern or 10 a.m. Pacific.
Okay.
It's fine for me, although, yeah, it works for me.
Okay. All right. Going once, going twice. All right. Sold. I'll set up a meeting.
Thank you. Bye.
All right. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Take care.
Thanks, everyone. Have a good one.
Thanks.